In the opulent mansion of a millionaire sheikh, his elderly and frail mother was forced to crawl across the cold floor. Her crime? Needing a simple medicine. But when her son returned unexpectedly, Sheikh Farid, having forgotten his passport in his morning haste, turned the key in the lock of the mansion's main door. A soft click echoed in the opulent silence, a sound that would normally go unnoticed, but which, on that day, would be the prelude to a devastating revelation. He expected to find the usual bustle of servants preparing lunch or the gentle laughter of his wife. Instead, a heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by a faint murmur coming from the main living room. Farid walked down the polished marble corridor, his footsteps echoing softly. As he approached the entrance to the room, the scene unfolding before his eyes struck him like a bolt of lightning. In the center of the vast hall, beneath the light filtering through the silk-adorned windows, was his mother, Fatima. Not comfortably seated in one of the velvet armchairs, nor walking with her cane, but kneeling on the cold floor, her aged fingers outstretched in desperate supplication. Her eyes, tear-filled and red, pleaded for something that seemed unattainable. Before her, with a sarcastic smile that stretched her red-painted lips, stood Zahira. His daughter-in-law, dressed in a gold-embroidered silk kaftan, held a small bottle of medicine between her fingertips, dangling it like an unattainable prize. A soft rattle of the pills inside the glass accompanied the movement, mocking Fatima's misery. The air seemed to freeze in Farid's lungs. Blood boiled in his veins, a scorching heat rising from his chest to his head. This was his mother, the woman who raised him, whom he swore to protect, humiliated and tortured in his own home. Zahira's betrayal, the cold cruelty in her gaze, was a poison spreading through his soul. Fury, relentless and overwhelming, seized every fiber of his being. Zahira, sensing her husband's presence, let the smile slide from her face, replaced by a mask of shock and then panic. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Farid gave her no chance. Without a single word of explanation, without a shout, he advanced. His eyes, once full of love and trust, were now flames of condemnation. He snatched the bottle from her hands, the glass clattering against the marble with a dry snap, and handed it to his mother, who clutched it like the most precious treasure. With a firm and decisive gesture, Farid pointed to the mansion door. The message was clear, unquestionable. Zahira, trembling, tried to argue, but a low, dangerous growl escaped Farid's lips, silencing her. She was expelled from the mansion and from his life forever. The sound of the door closing with a dull thud sealed her fate. Farid knelt beside Fatima, his strong arms enveloping her with a tenderness that contrasted with the fury of moments before. His mother's silent tears wet his tunic, but they were tears of relief and gratitude, not of pain. He helped her up, guided her to the most comfortable armchair, and with his own hands served her a glass of water, ensuring she took her medicine. Fatima's dignity, trampled for so long, began to be restored at that instant, under the watchful and loving gaze of her son. The gleam of gold in the mansion, once a cruel contrast to her misery, now seemed to reflect the promise of long-denied comfort and peace. Sheikh Farid, having left his passport behind in his morning rush, turned the key in the main door of the mansion. A soft click echoed in the opulent silence, a sound that would usually pass unnoticed, but which, on this particular day, heralded a devastating revelation. He had expected the familiar hum of servants preparing lunch, or the gentle laughter of his wife. Instead, a heavy quiet pervaded the air, broken only by a faint murmur from the main living room. Farid walked down the polished marble corridor, his footsteps echoing softly. As he approached the entrance to the room, the scene unfolding before his eyes struck him like a bolt of lightning. In the center of the vast hall, beneath the light filtering through the silk-adorned windows, was his mother, Fatima. Not comfortably seated in one of the velvet armchairs, nor walking with her cane, but kneeling on the cold floor, her aged fingers outstretched in desperate supplication. Her eyes, tear-filled and red, pleaded for something that seemed unattainable. Before her, with a sarcastic smile that stretched her red-painted lips, stood Zahira. His daughter-in-law, dressed in a gold-embroidered silk kaftan, held a small bottle of medicine between her fingertips, dangling it like an unattainable prize. A soft rattle of the pills inside the glass accompanied the movement, mocking Fatima's misery. The air seemed to freeze in Farid's lungs. Blood boiled in his veins, a scorching heat rising from his chest to his head. This was his mother, the woman who raised him, whom he swore to protect, humiliated and tortured in his own home. Zahira's betrayal, the cold cruelty in her gaze, was a poison spreading through his soul. Fury, relentless and overwhelming, seized every fiber of his being. Zahira, sensing her husband's presence, let the smile slide from her face, replaced by a mask of shock and then panic. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Farid gave her no chance. Without a single word of explanation, without a shout, he advanced. His eyes, once full of love and trust, were now flames of condemnation. He snatched the bottle from her hands, the glass clattering against the marble with a dry snap, and handed it to his mother, who clutched it like the most precious treasure. With a firm and decisive gesture, Farid pointed to the mansion door. The message was clear, unquestionable. Zahira, trembling, tried to argue, but a low, dangerous growl escaped Farid's lips, silencing her. She was expelled from the mansion and from his life, forever. The sound of the door closing with a dull thud sealed her fate. Farid knelt beside Fatima, his strong arms enveloping her with a tenderness that contrasted with the fury of moments before. His mother's silent tears wet his tunic, but they were tears of relief and gratitude, not of pain. He helped her up, guided her to the most comfortable armchair, and with his own hands served her a glass of water, ensuring she took her medicine. Fatima's dignity, trampled for so long, began to be restored at that instant, under the watchful and loving gaze of her son. The gleam of gold in the mansion, once a cruel contrast to her misery, now seemed to reflect the promise of long-denied comfort and peace. Sheikh Farid, his mind still engrossed in the complexities of the business awaiting him, only realized his passport was missing upon reaching the airport. A sigh of frustration escaped his lips before he ordered the driver to return to the mansion. The journey back was swift, the luxurious car gliding up the main driveway, stopping with a soft hiss of tires. Farid stepped out, his haste replaced by a strange quietude as he approached the door. He turned the doorknob, expecting the usual hum of the house, but found only a heavy, almost oppressive silence. His footsteps echoed down the polished marble corridor, each tap of his shoe on the floor unusually resonant. A faint murmur, almost a lament, broke the silence emanating from the main living room. A sense of unease, a chilling premonition, tightened in his chest. Farid quickened his pace, his heart beating harder with every step. As he reached the entrance of the vast hall, the scene unfolding before his eyes hit him like a physical blow. In the center of the gilded luxury, beneath the light filtering through the tall windows, was Fatima, his mother, the matriarch he loved so dearly and who should have lived in total comfort, was kneeling on the cold floor, her aged fingers outstretched in desperate supplication. Tears streamed down her age-lined face, and her eyes, red and swollen, were fixed on something unattainable. Before her, with a posture of superiority and a cruel smile that didn't reach her eyes, stood Zahira. His daughter-in-law, draped in a silk kaftan, shimmering with gold embroidery, held a small bottle of medicine. She swayed it gently, the pills making an irritating rattle inside the glass, as if mocking Fatima's agony. The sight was a shocking contrast, the splendor of wealth and the misery of humiliation, all orchestrated by his own wife. The air seemed thin in Farid's lungs. Blood boiled in his veins, a scorching wave of heat rising from his stomach to the tips of his hair. This was his mother, the woman who loved him unconditionally, treated like an animal, begging for her very life in her own home. Zahira's betrayal, the icy coldness in her gaze, was a poison spreading through his soul. Fury, relentless and overwhelming, consumed every fiber of his being. Zahira, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, looked up and saw Farid. The sarcastic smile vanished from her lips, replaced by a mask of shock and then pure panic. She tried to stammer something, but the words caught in her throat. Farid gave her no chance. Without a single word of explanation, without a shout, he advanced. His eyes, once full of love for her, were now flames of condemnation. He snatched the bottle from her hands with unexpected force, the glass clattering against the marble with a dry snap as it fell from Zahira's grasp, and handed it to his mother, who clutched it like the most precious treasure in the world. With a firm and decisive gesture, Farid pointed to the mansion's main door. The message was clear, unquestionable. Zahira, trembling from head to toe, tried to argue, her eyes pleading for clemency, but a low, dangerous growl escaped Farid's lips, silencing her instantly. Without further ado, she was expelled from the mansion and from his life forever. The sound of the door closing with a dull thud sealed her fate, echoing like a final verdict. Farid knelt beside Fatima, his strong arms enveloping her with a tenderness that contrasted violently with the fury of moments before. His mother's silent tears wet his tunic, but they were tears of relief and gratitude, not of pain. He helped her up, guided her to the most comfortable velvet armchair, and with his own hands served her a glass of water, ensuring she took her vital medicine. Fatima's dignity, trampled for so long, began to be restored at that instant, under the watchful and loving gaze of her son. The gleam of gold in the mansion, once a cruel contrast to her misery, now seemed to reflect the promise of long-denied comfort and peace, a new beginning for the matriarch. The silence that hung in the mansion after Zahira's departure was no longer oppressive, but a balm. A deep sigh escaped Fatima's lips as she leaned back in the velvet armchair. The warmth of the tea Farid had served her, warming her trembling hands. The sheikh, kneeling at her feet, held one of her aged hands, kissing it with a devotion that had long been dormant, stifled by routine and the deceptive presence of his wife. "Forgive me, mother," he murmured, his voice thick with guilt. "Forgive me for not seeing, for allowing such cruelty to happen under my roof." Fatima, her eyes still tear-filled, but now with a tender gleam, stroked her son's hair. "There is nothing to forgive, my dear. Your heart is good. Evil hides well, and you were blinded by love." Farid felt a knot tighten in his throat. The blindness of his love for Zahira had cost his mother her dignity, almost her life. He stood up, his broad shoulders tense with the responsibility that now weighed upon him. He called the servants, his voice resonating with a new urgency. Clear orders were given. The master suite, once occupied by him and Zahira, would be prepared for Fatima. Her downstairs room would be renovated to become a sanctuary for reading and prayer. A new team of nurses would be hired to ensure her medicines were administered precisely and with care, and that her health was constantly monitored. The mansion, once a stage for the silent drama of humiliation, began to vibrate with a different energy. The bustle of the servants, previously restrained and discreet, now carried a renewed purpose, a lightness that hadn't existed before. The sound of hurried footsteps and low voices filled the corridors, but they were sounds of care and dedication. Farid spent the rest of the day by his mother's side. He took her to the garden, Where the birdsong seemed more melodious and the scent of the flowers more intense, they talked for hours about the past, about the happy memories that the mansion's opulence had tried to erase. Fatima's laughter, a sound Farid hadn't heard in years, echoed softly among the foliage, a balm for his tormented soul. At night, as the full moon rose in the sky, bathing the mansion in a silvery glow, Farid sat on the edge of his mother's bed. She was already sleeping deeply, a tranquil and well-deserved sleep, a peaceful expression on her aged face. He watched the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the calm rhythm of her breathing. The image of her kneeling, pleading, still haunted him, but the sight of her now, safe and serene, brought profound relief. The journey of healing would be long, he knew. The scars of humiliation do not easily disappear. But at that moment, under the roof of his home, Fatima's dignity was restored. Sheikh Farid, who had failed to protect his mother, now became her unwavering guardian. He swore to himself that he would never again allow darkness to touch the woman who gave him life. The mansion, once a sanctuary of luxury and a stage for cruelty, would now be a true home, a refuge of love and respect. The silence of the night was broken only by the soft click of his mother's bedroom door latch as Farid withdrew, leaving her in her restorative sleep, knowing that dawn would bring a new day, a new beginning, for both of them. Farid did not go to his own room. Instead, his steps led him to the vast office, a sanctuary of cedar and leather where the most important decisions of his empire were made. The door closed with a soft click, and he found himself immersed in almost total darkness, broken only by the silvery moonlight filtering through the gaps in the blinds. He did not turn on the lights. He sat in the soft leather chair, the weight of the world seemingly resting on his shoulders. The image of his mother kneeling, begging for her medicine was seared into his mind. Zahira's cruel smile, the rattle of the pills, the despair in Fatima's eyes, it all replayed in a torturous cycle. Guilt was a bitter poison in his mouth. How could he have been so blind, so absorbed in his business, so deceived by a facade of beauty and devotion? The answer tormented him. He had allowed it. He had trusted, and his mother paid the price. A heavy sigh escaped his lips, a hoarse sound that was lost in the silence of the office. He swore, there in the dimness of the night, that his life would be dedicated to repairing the damage, to ensuring that Fatima lived her remaining years in a peace and comfort that surpassed any humiliation. The darkness of that night was no longer the darkness of ignorance, but the darkness of a solemn promise. Dawn brought with it a new light, a golden glow that spread through the mansion's luxurious rooms. For Fatima, awakening was different. Instead of the cold marble floor or the modest bed of her old room, she found herself nestled in soft silk sheets, the gentle scent of jasmine lingering in the air. The master suite, with its wide windows overlooking the blossoming garden, was a paradise of comfort. A ray of sunshine danced on the embroidered bedspread, warming her face. A soft creak of the door announced the arrival of a young nurse with a gentle smile and a tray of herbal tea and fresh fruit. "Good morning, Fatima," the nurse said, her voice soft as a breeze. "Sheikh Farid asked me to help you with your medicine and ensure you had a peaceful awakening." Fatima blinked, still absorbing the reality. The scene with Zahira, the medicine bottle dangling, seemed like a distant nightmare. But the tenderness in the nurse's eyes, the warmth of the tea in her hands, were undeniably real. She took her medicine without pleas, without humiliation, and each sip of tea seemed to wash away the sorrows of the past. The sound of birds singing outside the window, once muffled by the walls of her old room, was now a clear and joyful melody. Farid, meanwhile, had been up for hours. He had spent the night planning, reorganizing. The hum of the servants was now orchestrated by him personally. A new kitchen team prepared nutritious and delicious meals adapted to Fatima's needs. Gardeners pruned the rose bushes, and the sweet scent of freshly watered flowers permeated the corridors. He had contacted his lawyers to initiate divorce proceedings, a step that before would have been unthinkable but now was an urgent necessity. There was no regret, only an iron determination. Upon finding his mother in the garden, sitting on a marble bench, watching the butterflies, Farid felt a relief that warmed his chest. She seemed lighter, more serene. The wrinkles of worry on her face had softened, and a faint smile played on her lips. "How do you feel, Mother?" he asked, kneeling beside her, as he had the night before. "At peace, my son," she replied, her voice a little stronger, fuller, "as I haven't felt in a long time." She touched his face with an aged hand. "You did the right thing." Farid nodded, the guilt still present, but now attenuated by the sight of his mother regaining her essence. The mansion, once a stage of brutal contrasts, was transforming into a true home, a sanctuary of care and respect. The gleam of gold and marble now reflected the light of restored dignity, not the shadow of cruelty. Fatima's healing journey would be gradual, but each day brought a new step towards fullness. And Farid, the sheikh, who had been blinded by passion, now saw with clarity the true wealth of his life, the unconditional love of his mother. He knew that the shadow of Zahira and her actions still lingered in the air, a reminder of the past, but the future, he swore, would be built on the solid foundation of love and honor. The sound of the wind whispering through the palm trees in the garden seemed to carry a promise of calmer, happier days for the family matriarch. The wind that once whispered promises now transformed into the gentle murmur of life that day after day bloomed anew in the mansion. Fatima, nestled in her new suite, awoke no longer to fear, but to the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the vibrant birdsong from the garden. Her steps, once dragged and painful, gained a surprising lightness. She walked through the corridors, no longer with downcast eyes, but with her head held high, admiring the tapestries and artworks that were once just a blur in her hazy vision. The nurses, with their calm voices and genuine smiles, ensured her medicines were taken punctually, and that each meal was a moment of pleasure, not anguish. The gentle clink of cutlery on fine porcelain was a symphony of care. Farid observed his mother's transformation with a mixture of relief and persistent pain. The smile that blossomed on her aged face was a balm, but guilt still pounded in his chest. He had failed to protect her. This failure spurred him to even greater vigilance, not only over Fatima's well-being, but over Zahira's past. The expulsion was only the first step. The full truth, he felt, was still hidden. In the days that followed, Farid delved into the mansion's records and his personal finances, a labyrinth of documents that he, in his loving blindness, had largely left in Zahira's hands. The rustle of papers filled the office during the long nights he worked tirelessly. He began to notice inconsistencies, small deviations that, isolated, could be attributed to errors, but together formed a disturbing pattern. There were large sums of money transferred to unknown offshore accounts, extravagant purchases that did not correspond to any assets present in the mansion, and service contracts with shell companies. With each new discovery, Zahira's image as the devoted wife and respectful daughter-in-law crumbled further. She was not just cruel. She was a calculating predator. The click of the mouse in his office echoed the revelation of yet another suspicious transaction, another proof of duplicity. It wasn't just the humiliation of his mother. Zahira had systematically drained resources, using Farid's trust for illicit enrichment. The fury he felt upon seeing her mistreat Fatima was a breeze compared to the inferno that now consumed his being. He contacted his lawyers, not just for the divorce, but for a full investigation. The of phone calls to financial experts and digital security specialists filled the air. He wanted every detail, every diverted penny, every lie exposed. Zahira's shadow was not just a memory of cruelty, it was a complex web of deceit that stretched far beyond the mansion walls. Fatima, oblivious to the extent of her son's new battle, enjoyed her regained peace. The murmur of her prayers filled the new reading room, and her hands, once trembling with fear, now turned book pages with calm serenity. She spent hours in the garden, the joyful chirp of birds being her only company, watching butterflies dance among the flowers. Her health visibly improved, and her appetite returned with vigor. Farid, however, knew the fight was not over yet. The restoration of his mother's dignity was paramount, but cleansing the stain Zahira had left on his empire and his life was equally vital. He swore that he would not only expose her, but also recover every penny, unraveling every secret. The whistle of the night wind through the palm trees, once a harbinger of peace, now seemed to whisper the promise of an impending legal storm. A storm Farid was determined to win, to honor his mother and restore the integrity of his name. The whistle of the night wind through the palm trees, once a harbinger of peace, now seemed to whisper the promise of an impending legal storm, a storm Farid was determined to win, to honor his mother and restore the integrity of his name. Farid's promise was not empty. In the following days, the mansion became the epicenter of a silent but fierce battle. The office, once a sanctuary of cedar and leather, transformed into an investigation headquarters. The incessant typing of digital forensic experts' keyboards mingled with the rustle of documents that his lawyers meticulously reviewed. Every suspicious transaction, every offshore account, every contract with shell companies was dissected, revealing the extent of the web of deceit woven by Zahira. Farid worked tirelessly, his eyes fixed on screens and stacks of papers. With each new piece of evidence of diverted funds, the fury in his chest solidified, transforming into a cold, calculating determination. He sought not just divorce, he sought complete justice. The click of a pen signing a new mandate for his lawyers echoed his unwavering resolve. The sheikh, once a man blinded by love, now saw the world with ruthless clarity. His lawyers, led by the experienced Dr. Rashid, a man of serious demeanor and impeccable reputation, began to unravel Zahira's financial web. They discovered that she had created a series of shell companies in tax havens, using them to funnel funds from Farid's fortune into her own secret accounts. The extravagant purchases Farid had noticed were in fact fronts for money laundering, with overpriced or non-existent goods. The hum of printers spitting out bank statements and company records was the soundtrack of the truth coming to light. The investigation revealed that Zahira did not act alone. There were accomplices, small pawns in her game, who helped her move money and mask transactions. The murmur of confidential conversations between Farid and his legal team filled the nights as they traced Zahira's every step from the moment she entered his life. The extent of the scheme was astounding, totaling millions of dinars over the years. While the storm brewed behind the scenes, Fatima continued to flourish. The chirp of birds in the garden was her daily melody, and the gentle splash of water in the fountain calmed her. She spent mornings reading on the terrace, the sun warming her aged skin, and afternoons walking through the gardens, observing the flowers Farid had specially planted for her. Her appetite had returned, and the clink of cutlery at her meals was now a sound of satisfaction, not supplication. Farid, despite his exhaustion, made sure to spend time with his mother. He watched her, his heart heavy with past guilt, but warmed by the peace she radiated. On one of those afternoons, while having tea in the garden, Fatima held her son's hand. "You are tired, my son," she said, her voice soft. "I feel your worry, even if you don't say it." Farid squeezed her hand. "I'm just making sure everything is in order, Mother. That nothing else disturbs your peace." He couldn't burden her with the extent of the battle he was fighting. She merely smiled, a smile that held ancient wisdom. "I trust you, my son. I always have." Her words were a balm to his tormented soul. He knew the fight would be long and perhaps dirty, but the image of his mother, serene and confident, was his shield and his sword. Zahira's lawyers, upon receiving the first subpoenas and initial evidence, attempted an intimidation maneuver. The abrupt ring of Farid's phone, bringing the arrogant voice of one of Zahira's lawyers, was met with disdain. They threatened to expose family secrets, to tarnish Farid's reputation. But he was not intimidated. The fury he felt was greater than any fear of scandal. He was determined to see it through, to expose Zahira for who she truly was, not only to recover what was stolen, but to cleanse his family's honor and his own. The first divorce hearing was scheduled, and with it, the public revelation of the financial accusations. The rumble of distant thunder seemed to announce the storm that was about to erupt in the courts, a storm that promised to be as relentless as the justice Farid sought. He was ready. The rumble of distant thunder, which had announced the storm, was nothing compared to the fury that unfolded in the halls of justice. Farid, with a serious demeanor and impeccable posture, entered the courtroom, his lawyers by his side. The murmur of the press and public abruptly ceased at his passage, replaced by a tense silence, broken only by the click of cameras. News of Sheikh Farid's divorce and veiled accusations of misconduct had already spread like wildfire. Zahira was there, seated beside her own lawyers, her face made up with calculated coldness. Her eyes, once filled with a seductive sparkle, now carried an icy intensity, a mixture of defiance and resentment. She tried to hold Farid's gaze, but he ignored her completely, focusing on the judge who was preparing to begin the hearing. Dr. Rashid, with a calm that bordered on coldness, opened the case for Farid. He presented the divorce charges based on emotional cruelty against Fatima, and then delved into the complexities of financial fraud. The rustle of documents as bank statements, shell company records, and offshore transfers were displayed, filled the room. Every number, every date, every phantom company name was a stab at Zahira's castle of lies. The click of the projector displaying detailed graphs and tables of the drainage of millions of dinars was relentless. Zahira's lawyers, led by a burly man with a shrill voice, tried to discredit the evidence, claiming they were fabrications and that Farid was simply trying to avoid a generous divorce settlement. They painted Zahira as a victim, a devoted wife being slandered by a jealous husband and a senile mother-in-law. The sarcastic tone of Zahira's lawyer when referring to Fatima made Farid clench his fists, but he maintained his composure. The hearing dragged on, a battle of words and evidence. The thud of a gavel striking the judge's bench signaled the end of the first session. Farid left the courtroom under a barrage of questions from journalists, but his lawyers shielded him, allowing him to withdraw in silence. Fury simmered within him, but he knew the battle had only just begun. Back at the mansion, the contrast was stark. The gentle murmur of Fatima, reading a book in the garden, was a balm for Farid's soul. She was unaware of the intensity of the legal battle, only knew that her son was sorting things out. He sat beside her, watching the butterflies dance. The joyful chirp of birds seemed sweeter after the suffocating courtroom atmosphere. "How was your day, my son?" she asked, her gaze warm. "Productive, Mother. We're making progress," he replied, omitting the darker details. She nodded, a tranquil smile on her lips. "I know you will do what is right, my dear." His mother's words reinforced his determination. He was not just fighting for money, he was fighting for truth, justice, and his family's honor. Zahira's manipulation was not just financial, It was a profound betrayal of trust and love. In the days that followed, the media exploded with the news. Newspapers and television channels displayed headlines about the Sheikh's scandal and the fraudulent wife. The constant hum of Farid's phone, with calls from business partners and friends, was a reminder of the publicity's reach. He instructed his public relations team not to comment, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Zahira's lawyers, seeing the tide turn, tried a new tactic. They leaked fabricated stories to the press about Farid's personal life, about alleged past infidelities, and even about Fatima's mental health, in a futile attempt to tarnish the Sheikh's image and divert focus from her own transgressions. Farid's sigh of disdain upon reading the news was audible. He instructed his public relations team to issue a concise statement, refuting the allegations and reaffirming his confidence in the justice system. The truth, he knew, was his greatest ally. In the mansion, Fatima flourished. The chirp of birds in the garden seemed more melodic, the aroma of flowers sweeter. She did not read newspapers or watch the news, protected by Farid's care and the tranquility of her home. However, she sensed the change in the atmosphere, the lightness in her son's demeanor. One evening, as they dined, the gentle clink of cutlery on fine porcelain, she watched him with a sparkle in her eyes. "The truth always finds its way, my son," she said, a serene smile on her lips, "and justice, though it may be slow, always arrives." His mother's words echoed in Farid's heart. He had fought not only for his fortune, but for his family's honor and his mother's peace. The next phase would be that of formal retribution, and Dr. Rashid was ready to present the criminal case. The prosecution had already expressed great interest in the evidence, and the possibility of Zahira facing a prison sentence was increasingly real. The court prepared for the final phase of the divorce and the beginning of the criminal proceedings. The creak of the judge's chamber's door on the day of the final decision resonated with the gravity of the moment. The divorce verdict was delivered swiftly, granting Farid full custody of assets and rejecting all of Zahira's financial claims given the extent of the fraud. The decision was a crushing blow to Zahira, who remained silent, her expression blank as the judge read the sentence. But the battle did not end there. The judge announced that, based on the evidence presented, the case would be referred to the prosecution for formal criminal charges. The murmur in the courtroom turned into an outcry as the news spread. Zahira, who had remained stoic until then, felt the weight of reality. The snap of a photographer taking a picture of her, her face disfigured by defeat, seemed like a final hammer blow. Farid left the courtroom not with euphoria, but with a sense of conclusion. Justice had been served, and Zahira's house of cards had completely collapsed. He had kept his promise. Upon returning to the mansion, the whisper of the wind in the palm trees seemed to carry away the last traces of bitterness. Fatima awaited him, and her embrace was the true prize. Peace, finally, was unshakable. The end of an era had arrived, and the dawn of a new one, free from Zahira's shadows, was upon them. The news of the formal criminal indictment hit Zahira like a lightning bolt, shattering what remained of her illusion of untouchability. The divorce verdict, though devastating, was merely the prelude to the storm that was brewing. Now she faced the very real prospect of a prison cell. Her lawyers, once so haughty, seemed small and powerless before the prosecution, which acted with relentless speed and determination. The constant murmur among them, once focused on strategies, was now a lament of despair. The days that followed were a blur of panic for Zahira. She tried every imaginable tactic. She pleaded, threatened, attempted bribery, but the doors, once opened by her status, were now closed. The media, hungry for every detail, surrounded her temporary residence. The incessant click of cameras and the buzz of microphones were a constant soundtrack to her downfall. The headlines were brutal, and her name had become synonymous with fraud and cruelty. While Zahira drowned in her own despair, Farid found a serenity that had long been denied him. In the mansion, life returned to a rhythm of peace and healing. Fatima, her health visibly restored, spent hours in the garden, the aroma of roses and jasmine filling the air. The chirp of birds was the only melody that mattered, and the whisper of the wind in the palm trees seemed to carry away the last shadows of the past. Farid watched her, a genuine smile on his lips, feeling the weight of the world dissipate from his shoulders. Dr. Rashid, with his usual efficiency, coordinated the next steps with the prosecution. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimonies, the documents, the recordings of Zahira giving clear instructions for the illegal transfers. Justice, slow but relentless, was now in full motion. There would be no bargaining, no escape. One morning the inevitable happened, as Zahira attempted in an act of desperation to board a private jet to a non-extradition country. Law enforcement agents intercepted her at the airport. The sound of sirens filled the aircraft tarmac, and the flash of paparazzi cameras, who had somehow been alerted, exploded around her. Her cries of protest and indignation were muffled by the metallic click of handcuffs closing on her wrists. The image of her, face contorted with rage and humiliation, being escorted to a police car, would be plastered across every newspaper the next day. Zahira was taken to a cold, impersonal cell, a stark contrast to the opulent luxury she was accustomed to. The creak of the metal door closing behind her sealed her fate. There, alone with her thoughts, she finally confronted the magnitude of her ruin. There were no more servants to humiliate, no more jewels to display, only the oppressive silence and the smell of disinfectant. Farid received the news of Zahira's arrest with surprising calm. There was no euphoria, only a deep sense of relief and conclusion. He had promised justice to his mother, and that promise was being fulfilled. That night, as the gentle clink of cutlery echoed in the mansion's dining room, Fatima held Farid's hand. "Finally, my son," she said, her eyes tear-filled. "Finally, we can be at peace." The phase of formal retribution had begun, and Zahira's criminal trial was about to become the next big headline. The grand courtroom doors opened to what the press was already calling the trial of the century. The incessant click of cameras and the frantic murmur of the jostling crowd created an atmosphere of feverish anticipation. Zahira, escorted by guards, entered the courtroom with an expression that oscillated between defiance and pale terror. Her eyes, once filled with an haughty sparkle, now revealed the weariness of sleepless nights and the loss of control. She sat in her place, the rustle of her silk dress, now less luxurious, almost inaudible in the buzz. Farid was present, seated in one of the front rows, beside Dr. Rashid. There was no triumph on his face, only a serene gravity. He observed Zahira, not with hatred, but with an almost clinical distance, like one witnessing the inevitable end of a tragedy. His presence there was a silent testament to the truth, a pillar of strength for the process of justice. The bang of the judge's gavel echoed through the room, silencing the crowd and commencing the proceedings. The prosecutor, a man with a firm voice and imposing presence, began to present the case. He meticulously detailed every fraud, every diversion of money, every act of cruelty against Fatima, using the audio recordings and documents provided by the accountant. The prosecutor's voice was clear and incisive, and every word seemed like a nail in the coffin of Zahira's defense. The recordings, played for all to hear, revealed Zahira's coldness in planning the illegal transfers and her complete indifference to her mother-in-law's suffering. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom when Zahira's voice, in one of the recordings, demanded that Fatima crawl across the floor. Zahira's lawyers desperately tried to discredit the evidence, alleging manipulation and slander, but their arguments were flimsy. The testimony of the accountant, who had received immunity in exchange for his cooperation, was the final blow. He detailed with surgical precision Zahira's instructions, access codes, and the banks involved. The rustle of the documents he presented as evidence was a symphony of condemnation. Zahira, meanwhile, tried to maintain a facade of innocence, but her face betrayed her growing anxiety. She murmured to her lawyers, her eyes flashing with contained rage, but her interruptions were promptly silenced by the judge. As the drama unfolded in court, Farid's mansion remained a haven of peace. Fatima, oblivious to the public spectacle, spent her days in the garden, observing the joyful chirp of birds and feeling the gentle whisper of the wind through the palm leaves. Her health continued to improve, and her smile, once so rare, now lit up the house. Farid, upon returning from court, found in her the calm and perspective he needed. The aroma of flowers and the warmth of the tea she prepared were a balm for his exhausted soul. In the following days, Zahira's criminal case solidified. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, and the defense disintegrated with each session. The media, which once idolized her, now vilified her, and each headline announced another nail in her coffin. The buzz of cameras and the clamor of reporters outside the courtroom were a constant reminder of her downfall. On the day of the closing arguments, the courtroom was packed. The prosecutor delivered a powerful summary, painting a clear picture of Zahira's greed and cruelty. He requested the maximum penalty, emphasizing the premeditated nature of the crimes and the abuse of a defenseless elderly woman. The prosecutor's voice resonated with conviction. Zahira's lawyers made a last-ditch effort, trying to evoke pity, but their words sounded hollow against the overwhelming pile of evidence. Zahira, sitting in silence, her face pale and eyes fixed, seemed to have shrunk under the weight of the accusation. The judge announced that the jury would retire for deliberation. The silence that followed the announcement was almost palpable, broken only by the rustle of lawyers collecting their papers. Farid felt a knot in his throat. The conclusion was near. The phase of formal retribution was in its final moments, and Zahira's fate would soon be sealed. The creak of the jury room door closing seemed like a gate to Zahira's uncertain future. The silence that fell over the courtroom after the jury retired was heavy, laden with expectation and nervousness. Each minute felt like an hour, and the tick-tock of the clock on the wall was a hammer pounding in Farid's temple. He watched Zahira, who, though pale and tense, still tried to maintain a defiant posture. But her eyes, which once gleamed with malice, now revealed a deep, almost animal fear. Farid felt the weight of the journey that had brought them there, from the day he found his mother humiliated on the cold marble. He wished no one's downfall, but justice was an imperative, a debt of honor to Fatima. Hours dragged on. The restrained murmur of the crowd outside the courtroom was a distant sound, as the air inside the court grew increasingly dense. Finally, a movement at the jury room door. A rustle of footsteps announced the return of the jurors, their faces impassive, making it impossible to discern the verdict. The entire room held its breath. A deathly silence took over the atmosphere, broken only by the bang of the judge's gavel, which sounded with an eerie finality. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice resonating with authority. The jury foreman stood holding an envelope. His voice was clear and firm, and each word seemed to fall like a heavy stone onto the marble floor. "Yes, Your Honor, on all counts, we find the defendant, Zahira al-Hamad, guilty." A muffled cry escaped Zahira's lips. She swayed, and her lawyers held her to prevent her from falling. The murmur that followed in the courtroom quickly turned into an outcry of relief and satisfaction. Farid felt a knot in his throat loosen. There was no euphoria, only a deep and serene sense of conclusion. Justice, after so long, had prevailed. The judge restored order with another bang of the gavel. He continued, his voice unwavering. Given the premeditated nature of the crimes, the extent of the fraud, and the cruelty shown towards a defenseless elderly woman, this court imposes upon Zahira al-Hamad a sentence of 20 years in prison, with no possibility of parole before serving 15 years of the sentence. Zahira's legs gave way completely. She collapsed into the chair, her face contorted in a mask of horror and despair. Her eyes, once haughty, were now filled with tears of rage and humiliation. Her cries of protest were muffled by the metallic click of handcuffs closing on her wrists once again. Guards lifted her and escorted her out of the room, while the incessant flash of paparazzi cameras exploded around her, capturing her final collapse. Farid remained seated for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. Dr. Rashid placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of silent support. "It is done, Farid," he said, his voice soft. "Finally, it is done." Upon leaving the courtroom, Farid was met by a horde of reporters, their microphones pointed at him, their questions tumbling over each other. He did not respond. He merely nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. The buzz of cameras and the clamor of the media were mere background noise to the peace that began to blossom in his heart. Back at the mansion, the gentle aroma of roses in the garden welcomed Farid. Fatima awaited him on the veranda, the chirp of birds in the background. She did not ask, she did not need to. Farid's gaze was enough. She embraced him tightly, and the whisper of the wind in the palm trees seemed to sing a song of relief. "Peace, my son," she said, tears streaming down her aged but now serene face. "True peace." Farid held her, feeling the warmth of her embrace, the weight of the world finally lifted from his shoulders. Zahira's era had ended. The shadow that hung over the mansion and their lives had been dispelled forever. The path ahead was one of healing, of rebuilding, and of a future where dignity and love would reign supreme. Zahira's story would become a dark legend, a cautionary tale, but for Farid and Fatima, it was just a painful chapter that at last had been turned. Life in its fullness awaited them. The days following the trial unfolded like a gentle balm over the still fresh wounds. The mansion, once a stage for silent drama, now breathed an atmosphere of renewal. The silence that filled the corridors was no longer the oppressive silence of fear, but the tranquility of a home where peace had been restored. Fatima flourished each day. Her eyes, which for so long had carried the shadow of sadness and humiliation, now shone with a serene light. She spent mornings in the garden, the gentle murmur of bees among the flowers and the melodious chirp of birds filling the air. Her aged hands, once forced to crawl across the cold floor, now tenderly cared for the rose bushes, feeling the delicacy of the petals. The sweet aroma of flowers mingled with the scent of damp earth, a perfume of life and new beginnings. Farid watched his mother with a light heart. The guilt that had gnawed at him for not noticing her suffering had diminished, replaced by a profound gratitude for having had the chance to correct the error. He dedicated his time to her, sharing quiet meals on the veranda where the whisper of the wind in the palm trees cradled their conversations. They spoke of the past, but with a new perspective, and of the future, with simple plans full of affection. The mansion, once a stage for Zahira's ostentatious luxury and veiled cruelty, had been purified. The objects she most cherished were removed, and the space was filled with the elegant simplicity that Fatima had always appreciated. The gleam of the marble now reflected the sunlight, not the tears of a humiliated woman. Fatima's laughter, a sound Farid thought he had forgotten, now echoed softly through the rooms, a sweet and healing sound. Farid resumed his business trips, but with a crucial difference. Now, he maintained constant contact with his mother, and the trips were shorter, planned so he could return to the mansion and her company. He knew that true wealth lay not in his businesses or his fortune, but in Fatima's health and happiness. The ring of his phone with a message from her was always a reminder of what truly mattered. Zahira, meanwhile, was a distant memory, a closed chapter. News of her life in prison was sporadic and no longer captured Farid's or his mother's attention. She was paying for her crimes, and that was enough. Justice had been done, and the page turned. The silence surrounding her name in the mansion was a sign that her influence had completely vanished. One afternoon, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Fatima and Farid sat in the garden. She held a cup of tea, steam rising gently. "You know, my son," she said, her voice soft as the rustle of leaves, "life is like this garden. Sometimes weeds grow and try to choke the flowers. But if we take good care, if we pull out what is harmful, the flowers always bloom again, more beautiful than before." Farid smiled, taking his mother's wrinkled hand. The warmth of her touch was a familiar comfort. "It's true, Mother, and this garden, our house, our home, will never again allow weeds to grow." She squeezed his hand. The song of a nightingale echoed in the air, a pure and joyful sound. The peace they had sought for so long had arrived, not as an explosion, but as a constant whisper, a gentle and lasting presence. Fatima's dignity had been restored, her body healed, and her spirit renewed. Zahira's story became a cautionary tale, whispered in social circles, but for Farid and Fatima, it was merely a reminder of a dark time they had overcome together. They had found true wealth, unconditional love, mutual trust, and the serenity of a home where the hearts of a mother and son beat in unison, free from any shadow. The future stretched before them, not with the promise of material grandeur, but with the certainty of days filled with the beauty of simple things, with the joy of being together, the sound of Fatima's laughter, Farid's tight embrace, the perfume of roses in the garden. These were the treasures they would cherish forever. Life, in its fullness, not only awaited them, but enveloped them in a warm and eternal embrace.